Shock is a verb. Now I'll tell you that that we kind of we really went into some of the other stuff about chlorine, but this time we're going to do shock as a verb. This is one that we actually had a hard time naming it because we wanted to say, well, shock is a verb or shock as a verb, right? Because really what it comes down to is the products that are being sold as shock are tools to get to shocking the pool. So not necessarily shock, even though a lot of people call them that. And that's the difference between shock as a noun or shock as a verb. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brett.
All right. So Matt, you're gonna pepper in some fun croutons of information in here too. So shock, it's kind of funny because our industry, we like shock, right? The shock in a lot of other instances isn't necessarily a good thing. Electricians don't like shock for good reason. Eep. Um, Mechanics don't like shock, like think potholes, that sort of thing. So violent shake or jar. So sudden disturbance. Just to give a little context. So we're gonna go. Why do we shock? Why we should think of shocking as a verb, different methods to shock, breakpoint chlorination, and better ways of shocking. So why do we do it? Well, this one's kind of fun because we talked about it in the previous one. We need different things in the water to get rid of contaminants, whether the contaminants be combined chlorine, so actually chlorine that's got used up, that hooked up with contaminants, that's trying to break them down, that's turned into a byproduct. Other junk that's in the water. So I kind of like to describe it like this. If you think about sanitizers, so let's look at chlorine, for example. We've got chlorine, which we need it to sanitize. So we need it to kill pathogens, so bacteria and viruses. So it killed it, right? But we also need to oxidize or get rid of the dead bodies of the contaminants that are in the water. So the dead algae, the dead bacteria, the dead viruses, they're still floating around. So if we don't oxidize or break those down, those actually cause additional chlorine demand and they can cause other issues with your water quality. So we need to get rid of the dead bodies, which is kind of a weird way to start a presentation, but here we are. Happy Thursday, everyone. It's Thursday, right? Yeah. So shock, it's the act of breaking those things down, breaking them down to their base components so that they can either be filtered out via filtration or gas off and just leave into the atmosphere. So think of an indoor pool or a covered pool. If you're breaking stuff down and it can gas off, where does the gas go? If you're in a covered pool, it hits the cover and just hangs out until you burp the cover, which you should be doing every day to let that stuff out. If you're in an indoor pool, hopefully you got some good air handling equipment that can help pull some of that off the surface, because a lot of these gases or byproducts are heavier than air, so they'll sit on the top 3 inches of your water. Now, why that's a big deal, if you think about swimmers, professional swimmers, swim teams, where are they breathing? If they're doing freestyle or front crawl, tip their head, that top 3 inches, it can actually cause respiratory issues in swimmers. So it's breaking down your body, just like it can break down all the pool surfaces too. So we need to get rid of these things. So we can do it a couple different ways. We can do it chemically, we can do it mechanically, we can do it preventatively, which is might be the best one, because if you prevent the issue from happening in the first place, you don't have to deal with the after effects of it. See, we like proactive. We're getting ahead of it.
Yes. Love it.
So methods for shocking. Chlorine shock. Typically, breakpoint chlorination. You can use pretty much most types of chlorine to accomplish this, but there are two that most people land on, being liquid chlorine or cal hypo, just because fewer side effects from them, but not no side effects, just fewer. Mechanical equipment, point of contact, we'll talk about that more in depth, and chlorine-free shock, where you're oxidizing or breaking down contaminants without the use of chlorine. So breakpoint chlorination, the formula for it is if you've got, let's say, 2 parts per million of combined chlorine. So you did your chemical test and you've got 2 parts per million. Okay, I don't want combined chlorine. That's the used up, gnarly, bad chlorine that I'm not getting any benefit out of. It's actually just getting in the way in the water. So what do we do to get rid of it? Well, if we're going to breakpoint chlorinate, we take 2, which is how many parts per million of combined chlorine we have, multiply it by 10 to give us 20. So 20 parts per million of chlorine, of free chlorine, is what we have to add to actually overwhelm the combined chlorine enough to break it down and burn it out of there. So it really comes, think about that. 2 parts per million of combined chlorine, you need to add 20 parts per million of free chlorine. That could be a lot of free chlorine you have to add. And we've seen combined chlorine levels ridiculously high in certain instances where it's almost physically impossible to add enough chlorine to remove it. We've done different
But
talks
how
and
do you
things.
get that high, Brett? How
I'm
would it get that high?
I'm glad you asked, Matt, because go back to our example of you have two. Thank you for asking that question. You've got 2 parts per million of combined chlorine in your water, and you're supposed to add 20 parts per million. What if you only had 10? If you
Ooh,
only
it
had
makes it
10,
worse.
you're actually just making more combined chlorine. So that level is getting higher. So now, instead of 20 parts per million of free chlorine, you might have to add 30 or 40 parts per million of free chlorine just to overwhelm the combined chlorine that you have essentially created trying to fix the problem. And why that comes in to play a lot of times is the other factors that affect where your chlorine is efficient and where it isn't. So if your pH, so different other thing. So water balance factor, if your pH is really low, your chlorine is actually more efficient. But if your pH is really low, it's so efficient that your chlorine is so active, it's cannibalistic and it eats itself and it burns out way fast. If your pH is really high, your chlorine is lazy and you're not getting any benefit out of it. It's not doing what it needs to do. You could have a solid chlorine reading, but it's not working for you. It's just there. Um, so those
Cyanuric acid.
cyanuric acid affects the effectiveness of your chlorine. So if those factors aren't all in check or in range where you want them to be, you could have added 20 parts per million of free chlorine to get rid of your 2 parts per million of combined chlorine, but that wasn't enough because if your chlorine the chlorine that you added isn't efficient because you got other goofy stuff going on in your water, you see where you can run into problems. So
Okay,
it,
so
it
there is another factor to this too, right? What you're talking about, what Brett's talking about for everybody, is that in a real world, or maybe not in a real world, but in a lab, essentially you're talking about 20,000 gallons where you need 20 parts per million to get rid of 2 parts per million of combined chlorine. But you're not taking into consideration all the other stuff or all the other contaminants and the chlorine load, or the contaminant load and the chlorine demand in the water. And that's, chemistry is part of that. But let's go one step further. How many of you, because I know a lot of you are retailers, how many of you, when someone comes in for a water sample and you say, well, how big is your pool? And they go, nah, 20,000 gallons, right? Well, that's the de facto answer for people that don't have a fiberglass pool, because then they'll say 10,000 gallons. But what happens if that pool is 22,000 gallons, 23 or 24,000 gallons, or maybe the water's all the way to the top, or it's like at the bottom of the skimmer? Well, now you're not talking about a pool that's 20,000 gallons. You're talking about 22 or 24 or 26. And so if you say, okay, well, here's enough that you need to get 20 parts per million in 20,000 gallons, not considering the contaminant load, the water balance, or that it's 22 or 23,000 gallons, then essentially what happens is that you don't reach breakpoint chlorination. And then we have a problem with, like what Brett was saying, is that, well, next time it's not four bottles, it's 6 bottles or 8 bottles or 10 bottles or 12 bottles. So it's always best, if you're going to try to reach breakpoint chlorination, to, number one, balance the water, and then number two, use what you think you're supposed to, and then add a gallon, right? But and this is kind of where we should probably have
it's
more time for
safer to
this.
err on the side of more with chlorine
It is,
if
it
you're
is.
trying to take
But the
care of
other part of it
combined
is,
chlorine. But go back to your warranty
if you have a
stuff.
cover, you have to make sure that they keep the cover open, right? Because otherwise, then you have this, 20, 30, 40 parts per million of chlorine that's concentrating gas underneath the cover and just, trying to destroy everything that it's even by, and the higher the chloramines, or the gas, the more toxic it is, the more concentrated, the more toxic it is. All right. I think that
Yep.
I
We
should have
we
waited for
cut.
this one. Sorry.
No,
Sorry,
it's
Brett.
okay. So couple things to keep in mind. Chlorine, regardless of the type, is generally heavier than the water, so it'll settle down to the bottom. So pre-dissolve it if you can, so that you don't have little spots or prematurely wearing the color off of your pool surfaces. Long waiting period, so 12 to 24 hours. Not unheard of for the chlorine level to come back down where it's safe enough for people to swim in. High levels of chlorine can be hard on pool surfaces and equipment. We already said that about 30 times. Hazardous to store and use. I just go back to my grandma's house where she had a gallon of chlorine shock in the garage, and they accidentally hit it with a piece of equipment or something like that, and it punctured the bottle, and then we had chlorine all over the garage floor. It's just something. That's what comes to my mind, because I know a lot of homeowners don't take care to store chemicals the right way. Can impact water balance. Depends on the type of shock you use. So Matt and I already talked about pH being high on liquid chlorine and cal hypo. You add these things, it's making your pH higher. If your pH is higher, what's that do to the effectiveness of your chlorine? So you might have to add acid to bring it back down in range so you actually get the benefit that you're looking for. Can increase salt or calcium levels. For every gallon of liquid chlorine you add, you're adding a pound of salt. For every 1 part per million of free chlorine with cal hypo you're adding zero point 0.8 parts per million of calcium. That those levels only go up. You can't remove salt or calcium from the water. So you got to keep those in mind, especially if you're talking about ongoing balance issues, or if you're in an area of the country that has really high calcium from go. Or like Matt had mentioned at a previous training, if you're converting someone over to a salt pool and they've never had a salt pool before, but they've used a lot of liquid shock, test their water for salt before you add 30 bags of salt to it, because you may only need 10, because they could have a solid salt reading in the water already. All chlorine is not equal. We kind of talked about this already, just because the free chlorine, think of it as it's good. Free is good. We love freedom, right? Free is good. It's free. It's ready. It's hanging out in the water, waiting for contaminants to come in so we can break them down, get rid of them. Combined chlorine is the spent, used up junk that you don't get any benefit out of. You want it gone. So shocking with equipment, kind of. This is where we're talking about UV systems, AOP, ozone systems. They're really neat systems, really good. The thing to best way to think about these is when you're shocking with a chemical, you're actually adding it to the water. When you're trying to shock or oxidize with a mechanical system like one of these, you're actually bringing the contaminated water to the unit where it actually gets sanitized, because these are technically point of contact systems. So they will actively break down and oxidize contaminants from the water, but they're not treating the entire body of water all at one time. So if you're looking at this graph up here. If we've got any CPOs in the crowd, you'll probably recognize this one from one of the old CPO texts. But a pool with a 6-hour turnover, it almost takes an entire day for every gallon to get through the filtration system. So that may not make a lot of sense. But if you've got a 10,000 gallon pool, every 6 hours you're filtering 10,000 gallons, but you're not filtering every single gallon that was in that pool. Some of those gallons are going through multiple times. So after 6 hours, you still got 37% left unfiltered. Now, this is a general graph because every pool is different based on hydraulics, where the drains are, how they design the flow to go, dead spots. But roughly, it takes a whole day for almost every gallon to go through the filtration system. So if it takes a whole day, that leaves a lot of time where there is contaminants possibly in the water that are just hanging out that could still cause issues. I'm sorry if you hear a dog barking in the background. So good systems, they can help bring down combined chlorine levels, and help oxidize contaminants, but you're bringing the contaminants to the unit where it's actually doing the work, not the unit putting stuff into the water and actually treating the whole body. That's the main difference to consider. Different, better ways to shock. Again, proactive. So the blend that we've got, an Easy Pool and Pepper, an Easy Spa for that matter, it actually hangs out in the water. So if you've got an oxidizer that's present that can hang out for 7 to 10 days, and just like your chlorine, wait for contaminants to come in so it can break it down, you're breaking it down before it has a chance to form combined chlorine. Because if you're breaking it down and you're not using chlorine, it off gases as oxygen. It's not making trichloramine gas. It's not letting it have an opportunity to make combined chlorine that gets in the water and bums you out. And you're not using excessive level of chlorine to actually have to burn it out. So you're preventing combined chlorine, preventing the need for shocking later. You're actively shocking all the time that the pool's running. It makes things a lot easier, especially in salt pools, specifically, because like we already established, salt pools are special. They still have to take care of other issues, and some of the issues that happen in salt pools, most of the issues that happen in salt pools are caused by the salt cell running properly. Because when it's running properly, it's making things that make the pH go higher, which make your chlorine less effective, which cause scale to form, which so if you can minimize the impact, the negative impacts the salt system has, it makes the salt system that much better. Because there's some good salt systems out there, but if you can take the negatives and turn them into a positive, oh man, we're cooking with gas. Shock them with chlorine-free shock. So remember when we said if you added chlorine but not enough chlorine to breakpoint chlorinate, you're actually creating more chloramines? It's not like that with chlorine-free shock. With chlorine-free shock, if you don't add enough, you're still breaking down chloramines. You just might have to add a little more to finish it out. So if you don't add enough, you're still bringing combined chlorine level down, and then you can always clean it up later with whatever left your reading is. So it's more efficient that way, in that you're not just dumping in excess amounts of chlorine. Um, pH neutral products like OxySplash don't impact where the balance of the water is, so you don't have to worry about that. They function independently of cyanuric acid, which is awesome because if your cyanuric acid's high, your chlorine's not as effective. Off gas is oxygen. You can close your pool cover afterwards. I mean, there's 20 different reasons why it's a superior way to shock. Um, if you're not dealing with algae. If you're dealing with algae, use a form of liquid chlorine or use a form of chlorine to actually kill the algae. But there's nothing that says you can't use other products to help oxidize the dead contaminants of the algae out of the water or anything like that. So it's just kind of thinking a little bit differently. And this is a big one too, especially if you got kids. You can swim in 15 minutes versus 3 days later once the chlorine level has come down. Um,
Brett, if you think about it, there's a lot of people that the retailers deal with that will come and see them before or after they're going to Sprouts or Whole Foods or other healthier places like that. Those are the type of people that if you give them an option of, well, do you want to use a ton of chlorine and worry about what it does to the pool environment or the swimmers or your pool or anything like that, or would you rather have an option that doesn't raise the chlorine that high, right? That's actually something that you can close the pool and maintain the safety of having the safety cover, on the pool. I mean, there's all types of things that when we're talking about this kind of thing. There's a lot of tools to get you to the end result, and so it just comes down to which one is best for the person that you're talking to. Because a lot of you are, as retailers, you have to surmise what people are like and what is best fits into their routine. And so something like this is like, well, this is a better oxidizer than the oxidizers that are out there, other than if you're trying to kill algae. But you can use algicide along with OxySplash and not have to worry about raising the chlorine level. So there's lots of different ways to skin a cat, so to speak.
yep.
Sorry for the cat lovers out there.
We're going to Pittsburgh 20 different ways today.
Yes, that's right.
So yeah, that's pretty much what Matt was covering. Other chlorine-free options. So we said these are the preventers. This is the program that keeps you happy. Take care of it before it becomes an issue. And this is your troubleshooter if it's already an issue, because there's always going to be issues. There's always going to be people that don't run proactively, even as much as you want them to. So you got to kind of have to spread it out. So main thing to think about this one, people say, what's the big difference here? Well, these guys are long lasting. They hang out in the water and they wait and get after it. And they've got other functions aside from just non-chlorine shock. This one's a flash in the pan. You've got a problem. It wants to get in there and work on it and get it gone. So troubleshooter, preventative program. And we actually finished this one out a little bit early. But that's okay because I think Stacy, did you say someone had a question?
Stacy has a question
Yeah.
from Trevor.
Yeah, Trevor was asking, what is your take on UV pool systems for homeowners, and how does that affect the chemical market?
Overall, I like them. I think there's absolutely a place for them because anything you can do that helps take some of the workload off of the chemistry that's in the pool. I mean, you can safely run a lower chlorine level when using like UV, ozone, or AOP. If you're using Easy Pool or Pepper, you can actually cut back on how much you're adding of our product as well. Because if like we said in the previous presentation, it's all a combined system working together. So if you can add something that increases efficiencies across the board and makes things function better, look into it. There's absolutely a market for it. There's some people that have had issues with different UV systems in the past, and some of those stem from back when they first came out. They didn't necessarily have the understanding that certain wavelengths actively destroy or oxidize contaminants compared to actively destroying or oxidizing or burning out chlorine. So in certain instances, there were older units out there that if your water was flowing too slowly through the UV system, it had too much contact time with the bulb and it could actually burn the free chlorine out of there. They've actually been able to dial in most of the manufacturers that I've read up on recently. They've been able to dial in on the certain wavelength of light, of ultraviolet light that actually breaks down the contaminants and leaves your free chlorine alone, which is kind of the best of both worlds, because the last thing you want is to have something on there that's supposed to make your chemicals more efficient, last longer, and here it is eating it. So there's definitely pros and cons. UV.
Derek in the chat said that we have a pool that we use Revive Easy Pool and UV, and it stays beautiful even if we miss a week, and the chlorine drops to 0.1.
Yep.
And you know, the frankly, I mean, to Trevor's point, to your point, Brett, is that you know, over the course of the last couple years, there's probably been a lot of people you come in contact with that were not germaphobes that are germaphobes now, right? And so if you are sitting there and you're trying to talk to someone about, you know, are they skittish about organic waste or contaminants, about all that kind of stuff, UV is a great system, a great add-on system to put in there to keep them at ease, to help, you know, to help tell them, hey, look, this is going to help destroy all kinds of contaminants and bacteria and, you know, funk that you don't want to think about, you know, that gets in your pool. And so if that alone helps them to enjoy the pool or not be so uptight about the contaminants in the water, especially if they have an aversion to chlorine, right? And I say that, you know, quote unquote aversion to chlorine, because all of you probably come into contact with people that say, well, I have a salt pool because I'm allergic to chlorine. And you're like, well, no, you're not, because you're making chlorine, right? I mean,
sure
so
you
if
are,
that's
honey.
the case, yeah, if that's the case, then how are you taking a shower with tap water, right? Because that has chlorine in it too. But, you know, again, it goes back to what Brett was saying earlier in another seminar. It's like, you don't want to make your consumer feel foolish, right? So you listen to what they have to say, then you explain the things that you can offer to help alleviate that pain point for them. And in this case, having UV along with whatever normal stuff you do, or even better, like Derek says, use UV and Easy Pool together, and you're gonna have water that's crystal clear, contaminant free, good feeling, you know, because when you use Easy Pool, that actually adds active oxygen to the water, which cuts surface tension, which makes the water feel wetter. So in other words, you'll get out of the pool and your skin will feel better than when you got in, right? So all those things together make a great experience, and it makes people think, oh, my pool feels much better than the one at the resort, or my neighbors, or my parents, or whatever. And there's something different, and Derek is the one that did it, or Trevor's the one that helped me with it, or whatever. And so that way it just helps to get your name out there and get more people coming in to understand the way that you do things, right? There's all kinds of crazy municipal water supplies, you know, and it used to not be that way, but at the advent of using chloramines, believe it or not, but they're using monochloramines and dichloramines as a way to sanitize the water because it's cheap. What happens then is, depending on the amount of contaminants in the water that they're filtering and sending to your house, that chloramine has to be higher. So you can definitely see that in areas where, when you fill a pool and the pool has a green tint, that means that they've been using chloramines. And so whenever you're drinking tap water, you're drinking used chlorine, bro. I mean, come on, right? So again, you know, that's something that's not necessarily that you're going to tell everybody, because you don't want to scare people out of your store either. But you can say, look, there's lots of different ways to take care of these contaminants, whether it be mechanically or chemically or hydraulically, you
or
know,
a combination.
it's something that you can help them with, right? A combination of all three. So definitely something to keep up. And thanks, you guys, for being at the forefront of that, because that's one of the big things for API water, is we're trying to make the water healthier for swimmers to enjoy, right? And using something, and it's 10:55, but let me just say one last thing. Something that we didn't cover in this is the amount of single-use plastics that are used in our industry in a year. And I know that well, at least, I mean, if you guys know me, you know, I'm not a tree hugger, but no one goes out, no one really should go out to destroy the environment either. So if there's a way that we can control some of the plastic waste that gets into landfills, gets into, you know, the ocean and stuff like that, that's definitely something that we should probably consider, right? And so one of the things about OxySplash, not to be the dead horse, But when you're talking about a pallet of 2-pound Oxysplash is the equivalent dosage of 13 pallets of liquid chlorine. You think about on 13 pounds of liquid chlorine, how many thousands of empty bottles that are single-use plastics that have to go somewhere. Instead, you're using literally, a couple hundred 2-pound bottles, and that's even if you want to like use as much plastic as possible. You could use 25 pounds of Oxysplash, and that's the equivalent of 50 liquid chlorine gallons, right? Or liquid chlorine bottles, one 25-pound container. So that's a huge difference when you come to people who want to have a healthier lifestyle, want to treat their kids to a healthier lifestyle, want to help with plastic waste and all the other stuff. That's definitely something that you can throw into your sales pitch, right? Okay.